It's almost 500 days since Russia invaded Ukraine. War fatigue has truly set in. Drone strikes don't shock people anymore, neither do multi-billion-dollar arms packages. It's all become routine. But one thing still forces world leaders to sit up and take notice: the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. Here it is on the map. It is located in southern Ukraine. It is the largest nuclear plant in Europe, but right now it's under Russian control. Their soldiers captured the power plant around 16 months back. Since then, we have heard warnings after warnings. Russia will blow up the reactors, Russia will cut off water supply, Russia will sabotage the facility, but none of it has actually happened. On Tuesday, President Zelensky issued another warning. He says Russia has placed explosives on the roof of Zaporizhzhia. Listen to this.
Now we have information from our intelligence that the Russian military has placed objects similar to explosives on the roof of several power units of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. It's probable they needed to simulate an attack on the plant, or they could have some other kind of scenario.
And what is Russia saying? The very opposite. They claim Ukraine is planning to drop ammunition on Zaporizhzhia. But here's the thing about both these claims. A, there is no evidence. And B, we've heard too many of them before. In August last year, Zelensky warned of a nuclear catastrophe. He said Russia was using nuclear blackmail. In November, he warned of sabotage. The Ukrainian president urged NATO to protect the power plant. In March this year, he said Zaporizhzhia was being held hostage. Again, sort of blackmail. And in June, the president again warned of sabotage. These are just some of the major instances. Zaporizhzhia always figures in Zelensky's speeches and statements, and every time Russia has responded in the same manner. They've turned around and accused Ukraine. So what are both sides up to? In August and November last year, there was a real threat. We saw some nearby installations being shelled. Even the United Nations atomic watchdog was spooked. But since then, it's been tough to decode. The power plant itself has been disconnected. It's not plugged into Ukraine's national grid anymore. Plus, attacking Zaporizhzhia would make no strategic sense. You would open yourself up to global condemnation. You would also douse 1 million people in radiation. So logic says, do not attack. But warning of an attack is different. Both sides have accused each other of plotting attacks on Zaporizhzhia. Ukraine has used it to rally support. The UN atomic watchdog sided with them. The agency's chief has visited Zaporizhzhia thrice. And he called for Russia to hand over control to Ukraine. Even the government of India was sympathetic. Prime Minister Modi spoke to Zelensky about the nuclear threat. He said endangering such facilities would be catastrophic. So could this be a case of Ukraine crying wolf? Of trying to build pressure on Russia? Well, that's one possibility. Having said that, you cannot dispute one fact. It was Russia who attacked the plant first. Until March last year, Ukraine controlled the Zaporizhzhia plant. But Russian troops fought their way to capture it. So clearly, the Kremlin was interested in it. They wanted to control this high-value, high-risk target. The question is why? For starters, around 50% of Ukraine's power is nuclear. Zaporizhzhia used to produce around 6,000 megawatts. If you control this plant, you can turn off the lights. Perhaps that's one reason. Another possibility is to weaponize fear. If there is an accident, the Ukrainian army will have to mop up. It's their people who would be affected. Keeping that threat alive is useful for Moscow. But these are just possibilities and theories. So let's focus on what we do know. There have been dozens of warnings, but none of them have materialized. Does that mean we should just ignore it? Well, that's the trouble. How do you ignore a nuclear plant in the middle of a war zone? Both sides know it's impossible. It doesn't have to be a planned attack or sabotage. It can be unintended, like a wayward missile cutting off electricity to the plant, or fatigue and mental issues of the local staff. That is even more likely and dangerous. Just yesterday, there were more drone strikes on Ukraine. Around 43 people were injured in the Kharkiv region. Kiev says there is a counter-offensive underway. But from the looks of it, the front lines are frozen. A couple of months from now, winter will set in, which means the front lines will actually freeze over. So the biggest threat to Zaporizhzhia is not some calculated and devious strike. It's A, an unintended disaster, and B, desperation. If you're desperate enough, you will forget logic. You will even attack a nuclear plant and blame it on the other side. The question is, who will reach that point first? There's an old saying in journalism: If one person tells you it's raining and another tells you it's not, you're not supposed to report both sides. You're supposed to look outside and see for yourself. I'm afraid times have changed. Nowadays, journalists see what they want to see. Just look at the recent riots in France. We showed you the pictures on Monday. There were vehicles burning on the streets, police officers chasing and arresting protesters. It was clearly evidence of long-running problems in France, like racism or the backlash against immigration. But Western media did not see it that way. Look at this article in Politico. It's called "The Politics of the French Riots." In fact, let me read out what it says. This is largely an insurrection without aims. The riots are, in a sense, anti-France. Thank God it wasn't in India or Bangladesh or South Africa, because then the riots would have been pro-democracy. Next, we have the Washington Post. They say the protests will create an opening for the far right. How about that? These people were outraged by systemic racism. They were fed up of being treated as second-class citizens, but when they protest, they're accused of helping the far right. Classy from the folks at Washington Post. Guardian also had a problematic take. Look at their headline. A grim tale of the growing gulf between haves and have-nots. They're calling it a class war. Maybe there is a class element to it. But shooting a 17-year-old at point blank is not just a class problem, it's a race problem. This was targeted racism. Guardian had no problem using such language about India. Look at their report on the Delhi riots. And let me quote that for you. The violence in Delhi is not a riot, it's targeted anti-Muslim brutality. I have more examples for you. The New York Times is calling this a new challenge for Macron. They're not blaming his policies for it, they're simply calling it a challenge. Wall Street Journal is not even concerned about the protests, they're worried about the French cops. Look at two of their reports. French riots test Macron's loyalty to police, as if that's the bigger issue here. Another headline says, behind the riots lie years of anger over police conduct. So it's not systemic racism, it's not anti-immigration sentiments either, it's all about police conduct. The New York Times has said the same thing. French police won authority to shoot at drivers but got no training whatsoever. Do you really need training for that? Not shooting 17-year-olds comes naturally to most people. I guess in France, you have to be taught. Now compare this to how they cover Indian police. Look at the same New York Times during the Delhi riots, and I'm quoting, how Delhi's police turned against Muslims. A few anecdotes, a handful of statements, and job done. The NYT published a smear piece on Delhi police, but in France, it's all about the lack of training. You can understand what the strategy is here. Don't blame the leader, don't blame the institutions, instead blame complex issues like class and history. But elsewhere, it's the opposite. Let me also show you another set of headlines. This is from Le Monde. It's a French newspaper. India's Modi fails to respond to an outpouring of hatred against Muslims. They're going straight after the head of government. Now look at their coverage of Macron. Riots in France, Macron bases three-stage response on empathy, firmness, and a moral jolt. I guess arresting 3,000 people is empathy. And so is suggesting that social media should be limited. The fact is, social media can inflame such situations. But when other governments do it, it is draconian. When Macron does it, it's a moral jolt, whatever that means. And it's not just India. The Western media does it with most Asian and African leaders. Look at Politico's headline on Bangladesh. Does Bangladesh's Prime Minister still believe in democracy? Again, a direct attack on the head of government. A couple of reports questioned the arrest of government critics, so Politico ran this headline. And we're not saying it's a bad headline. We're saying do the same for France. The Western media has been handling France with kid gloves. No explosive headlines, no incisive editorials. It's all been rather nice and polite. The New York Times even ran this informative report. Traveling to France, here's what you need to know about the protests. Such coverage comes from inherent racism. Any unrest in the West is an anomaly for them. But any unrest in Asia or Africa is the norm, and most likely the government's doing. The result of state-sanctioned oppression, as they put it. Yesterday, we told you about the SCO summit. Prime Minister Modi hosted it. Leaders from China, Pakistan and Russia were in attendance. At the end of it, they released a joint statement. It's called the New Delhi Declaration. But looks like New Delhi is not too happy about it, or at least parts of it. There was one obvious elephant in the room, the differences between India and China. Now, there are differences with Pakistan as well, but let's stick to the members that matter. The joint statement reaffirmed support for China's Belt and Road Initiative. But one country stayed away, and that country was India. Take a look at the statement. This is what it says. Reaffirming their support for China's BRI initiative, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Pakistan, Russia, Tajikistan and Uzbekistan note the ongoing work to jointly implement this project. All members except India supported it. And there's nothing new about this position. India has never supported China's Belt and Road Initiative. One, because it undercuts India's position in the region, and two, because it violates India's sovereignty. You see, the BRI has multiple projects in Pakistan. It's called the CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Some of those projects are in Pakistan-occupied Kashmir, so naturally, India does not support it. Prime Minister Modi made that position clear in his opening remarks. He said connectivity cannot violate territorial integrity. Listen to this.
किसी भी क्षेत्र की प्रगति के लिए मजबूत कनेक्टिविटी का होना बहुत ही आवश्यक है। बेहतर कनेक्टिविटी आपसी व्यापार ही नहीं, आपसी विश्वास भी बढ़ाती है। किंतु इन प्रयासों में एससीओ चार्टर के मूल सिद्धांतों, विशेष रूप से सदस्य देशों की संप्रभुता और क्षेत्रीय अखंडता का सम्मान करना बहुत ही आवश्यक है।
Now, Belt and Road is not just any other project. It is Xi Jinping's favorite project, his grand plan to dominate the world. In 2017, he organized the first Belt and Road Forum. It was planned meticulously. Around 30 heads of state and government flew in. So did top bosses of the World Bank, the IMF, and the World Trade Organization. It was Xi Jinping's moment to shine. But guess who boycotted that meeting? India. New Delhi's absence was a big setback to Xi Jinping, and the very next month, Doklam happened. China began deploying soldiers and equipment at the tri-junction between India, China and Bhutan. The standoff lasted more than 2 months. Many say it was payback for India's Belt and Road snub. The standoff ended ahead of the BRICS summit in China. There was speculation that Prime Minister Modi could skip. So Beijing agreed to defuse the situation. But in 2020, there was another escalation, the one in the Galwan Valley. The standoff is yet to be diffused, the one in Galwan. But there was a repeat of 2017 last year. In September, China agreed to disengage from certain points in Ladakh. Not all of them, but some of them. Days later, the SCO summit took place in Uzbekistan. Prime Minister Modi came face to face with President Xi Jinping. And my point is this. China is very invested in the Belt and Road, and it's willing to use every trick in the book to get India on board. Force, diplomacy, trickery, especially in the current situation. The BRI has lost steam since the Wuhan virus pandemic. The investments have stalled. The projects have been delayed. So some countries are even looking to leave the forum. Countries like Italy. Their new government is all set to quit the BRI. So China needs to inject momentum into Xi's pet project. But if they're betting on India, it's a useless bet. We told you how New Delhi refused to support BRI in the joint statement, but that was not the only difference of opinion. The SCO also came up with a development strategy for 2030. Once again, India did not sign on. Why? Because it was riddled with Chinese agenda. I'll give you examples. It talked about the Global Development Initiative. It was proposed by Xi Jinping in 2021. India decided not to support that document. Look at what the New Delhi Declaration says about it. The SCO considers it important to ensure the implementation of the Economic Development Strategy 2030 adopted by interested member states. Not all member states, interested member states. All of this signals the friction within the SCO. At the same time, it shows why India must hang on to it. If the joint statement looks like this, when India is the president, imagine what it will look like without India on board. Probably like the Xi Jinping thought. So India's presence in the SCO is not about aiming high, it's about limiting China's march into Central Asia. Yesterday's summit and joint statement reflect that attitude. So India is standing up to China, not just in the SCO, but also in Africa. Africa is the second largest continent in the world. It is resource rich and it has long been ignored. In the colonial times, the West divided it. They invaded and colonized 90% of the continent. Historians call it the scramble for Africa. But in the last few decades, China has taken over. It has turned Africa into its playground, invested billions of dollars, built roads, bridges, power plants, basically entered every business in practically every country. And what did China get in return? Abundant resources and an untapped market. The West is waking up to this, and India is making some moves. Tonight, we want to focus on what India's game plan in Africa is. There's a clear effort to court African powers. India is working on three fronts: investments, trade, and diplomacy. And we look at all of them, starting with investments. New Delhi is now the second largest creditor to Africa. The first is China. In other words, after China, India is lending the most amount of money to Africa. I have some numbers. In the last 10 years, India has given $32 billion in credit to Africa. And what is this money for? Metro rails, water supply lines, power plants, and other infrastructure projects. 42 African nations have received this. In fact, out of all the loans that India extended in the last decade, Africa makes up 38%. It shows you how seriously India is pursuing this. New Delhi has opened 195 lines of credit. These are linked to specific projects. And this is 3 times more than India's credit lines in Asia. Let me also tell you which countries are the top recipients: South Africa, Mauritius, Mozambique, Sudan, and Egypt. Indian companies are investing in these countries too, also in Ghana and Nigeria. Which brings us to trade. India's main exports to Africa are petrol and pharma products. Imports include crude oil, gold, coal, and other minerals. Bilateral trade with Africa grew by more than 9% last year. It touched almost $100 billion. The plan is to double this in the next 7 years. So $200 billion by 2030. But how will India achieve this? Which brings us to our third point: diplomatic engagement. In 2015, India organized the India-Africa Forum Summit. It was called India's largest ever Africa outreach. In 2018, Prime Minister Modi addressed the Ugandan parliament. He outlined the Kampala principles, 10 principles guiding India's Africa engagement. And since then, there has been a lot of diplomatic push. In the last 9 years, India opened 25 new embassies or consulates. 18 of them were in Africa. In February, New Delhi hosted the Voice of the Global South Summit. Africa was part of that. India is also pushing for the inclusion of the African Union in the G20. If you connect all these dots, you'll see this. Africa is one of India's foreign policy priorities. It helps that both sides share historic ties, and these relations are shaped by colonialism and its repercussions. Both have suffered. Both India and Africa also have a young demographic, quite a lot of potential, and a growing diaspora. Africa is home to about 3 million people of Indian origin. 1 million of them are in South Africa. So people-to-people ties already exist, which makes the partnership organic. But despite these convergences and India's push, it has a long way ahead, mostly because it made a late start. China saw Africa's economic potential long ago, and it got there first. The rest of the world, including India, is only playing catch-up. China is Africa's largest economic partner. Trade in 2021 was worth more than $250 billion. In the last decade, Beijing pledged more than $134 billion to Africa. $134 billion. That's 11 times what India has offered. China has also made early moves to tap mineral resources like lithium and bauxite. So like I said, a lot of catching up to do. Thankfully, the world is also realizing the pitfalls of Chinese loans. They almost took over the airport in Uganda. Projects with China end up compromising national assets. India can be a credible and reliable alternative. It should build on cultural and historical ties and stay the course on diplomacy. For starters, revive that India-Africa summit. The third edition, like we said, was held in 2015. Now is a good time to work on the next one. The United States is celebrating July 4th, its Independence Day. In 1776, America became independent on the 4th of July. And since then, it has been one of the biggest holidays, a day of fireworks, hot dogs, and patriotism. But not this time. This time, Americans are low on morale. They don't seem as proud of their country. This is according to a new survey, and the findings are hardly surprising because the US as a country is at a crossroads. Mass shootings have become an everyday affair. Women no longer have rights over their bodies, and the United States is more divided than ever before. So what's there to celebrate? Here's a report.
It's the 4th of July in America, a day of fireworks, parades and patriotism. There are hot dog eating contests, key lime pie tournaments, and mass shootings. Not one, but 3 mass shootings. In Philadelphia, Baltimore, and Fort Worth, 10 people were killed, 38 injured, and the president repeated his same message again.
But Congress needs to step up, pass common sense gun safety laws to protect our kids and educators. And by the way, arming teachers is not the answer. Arming teachers is not the answer. Banning assault weapons and high-capacity magazines, extensive background checks, they're part of the answer. They'll make a big difference.
The motives are unclear, but it looks like even on July 4th, America could not let go of guns.
Come to me, hands up, keep coming.
So what's there to celebrate? Is it the mass shootings? There have been 340 so far this year. Is it the growing curbs on abortion rights? More and more states are restricting them. Is it the curbs on LGBTQ rights? The new Supreme Court verdict is chipping away at equality. Or is it the growing political divide? A widening partisan divide between Democrats and Republicans. For many people, this is a difficult holiday. They are no longer proud to be American. Extreme national pride is at an extreme low. 60% of Republicans still claim extreme national pride, but even that share has fallen. It used to be 86% in 2003. So morale is down, but what about America's morality? That's poor too. 50% of Americans say that the state of morality in the US is poor. This is according to a Gallup poll. And that's not all. The share is rising across the country, across both major political parties and even some independents. So, is this a moment of reckoning for America? Is it time for a rethink? It was long known as the land of freedom, the land of equality. But the last few years have shattered that notion. All people are equal, but in today's America, some people are more equal than others. Abraham Lincoln called the Declaration of Independence the immortal emblem of humanity. He called America the last best hope of Earth. But how can the United States be the beacon of hope when its people are not hopeful on their Independence Day?
And now it's time for Vantage Charts, images that tell the story. Yesterday we showed you a Japanese sea turning red. Today we bring you visuals of a Japanese river turning lime green. No one knows what happened and why this happened. But an investigation is underway. On a Florida beach, swimmers got a surprise guest, a shark. It was captured on camera swimming alongside beachgoers. In India's Nagaland, giant boulders crushed cars after a landslide, killing 2 people. The horrific footage was captured on a car's dash cam. And finally, what makes the 5th of July significant? We're taking you back in history to the year 1977, to Pakistan's Black Day, when General Zia-ul-Haq raised a coup. He seized power from President Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, leading to 11 years of martial law in the country. We're leaving you with these images. Thanks for watching. We'll see you tomorrow.